I rise today in opposition to House Bill 1538. This legislation, while written with the best of intentions, would create a statewide policy in response to a single local example of a disagreement between the police commissioner of Philadelphia and rank-and-file officers. If enacted, it would force every law enforcement department in the Commonwealth to respond to certain situations in a manner that may not be in their best interests, or the best interests of their respective communities. But much more important than that, Mr. Speaker, is the chilling and detrimental impact the veil of secrecy proposed by this bill after an officer discharges a firearm or uses force would have on the relationship between law enforcement and the general public. We live in a society that survives by the rule of law. As makers of the law, we here in this body view law enforcement as our partners. While we create the law, they are the glue that makes the law stick. But we also live in a free society, Mr. Speaker. A free society only continues to exist when transparency and openness in government continue to exist. This body, over the last decade or so, has gone to great lengths to enact measures to provide and ensure transparency and openness. Mr. Speaker, we cannot forget that police officers are public servants hired by public officials, paid for with public dollars, and are charged with using public resources to provide public safety. While I wholeheartedly disagree with this legislation, I commend my good friend, the gentlelady from Philadelphia, for providing an opportunity for this General Assembly to begin a conversation about the state of the relationship between these public servants and the public at large. Mr. Speaker, I believe we're at a crossroads, not just in Philadelphia, not just within this Commonwealth, but throughout American society. We don't need to recount and dwell on every sensational police encounter captured on video and broadcast on cable news and the internet to illustrate this problem. In fact, for every one of those encounters, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of other encounters between law enforcement and the general public that are handled professionally and without any violent outcome. To illustrate and to get to the heart of what lies beneath the crossroads we have come to only requires recounting an experience most of us, if not every single one of us in this chamber, have had at one time or another. Colleagues, imagine yourself driving down the highway. You're in your car, minding your own business, breaking no laws. You look in your rearview mirror and notice that a police squad car is following you. Do you suddenly relax and think to yourself, thank God he's back there, I feel so much safer now? No. Mr. Speaker, the typical reaction is to tense up and worry over what might happen next. This is not a healthy way to view a potential encounter with public servants charged with providing public safety. This is not an example of how we react when thinking about dealing with those we trust. As the makers of law in a free society, we must insist that the relationship between law enforcement and the general public is a relationship built on trust. As with any other relationship, openness and transparency are the key to maintaining trust. I know of no relationship in human history that has benefited from a veil of secrecy like the one proposed in House Bill 1538. When any public servant is involved in a situation where the laws we are charged with making or enforcing come into play, our default position should always be openness and transparency rather than secrecy. I share the gentlelady from Philadelphia's concern about the possibility of police officers being harassed or subjected to violence, simply in response to performing their legitimate duties. And we must condemn any individual or movement that calls for open violence against law enforcement that does its job properly. However, no such threats exist in Pennsylvania. Even in arguably one of the most dangerous jurisdictions in the country, Los Angeles, California, police officials promptly released the identity of officers involved in shootings, and no such case of retaliation has been reported. I would argue that if we mandate this veil of secrecy for every jurisdiction in the Commonwealth, we risk putting police officers in even more danger. If a questionable shooting or use of force occurs and the individual officer in question is not identified, would that not put every officer in that department under suspicion? Every police encounter is unique. Every law enforcement jurisdiction should be free to release or not release the identifying information of officers based on the best judgment of its local leadership as to how that information may impact any given situation. I trust our local police chiefs and administrators to make that call wisely. But in considering the discharge of firearms and use of force, Mr. Speaker, we must also acknowledge that despite the fact that the vast majority of law enforcement officers perform their duties with professionalism and valiance, there are some that have used excessive force, abandoned professional detachment, and otherwise exceeded the authority of the badge. Our focus here should be to address the underlying causes of why these things happen, not to make a one-size-fits-all rule to eliminate public scrutiny in instances of public servants performing their public duties in providing public safety. The discharge of a firearm or use of force by a police officer should be reserved for the most extreme of circumstances. With the advent of video footage and the instant news cycle, we're all being exposed to more and more of these cases every day. In the aftermath of many such cases, we often hear that the officer in question did it by the book. Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, just perhaps, that book should be rewritten and improved. Maybe it's time to take an objective look at how law enforcement recruits and screens new officers. Perhaps new initiatives in training those officers would be productive. Maybe we should encourage the vast majority of good and decent officers to expose those in their ranks who are not performing their duties in a professional manner. And perhaps we ought to re-examine the wisdom of turning our police departments into something visibly similar to paramilitary forces. But to mandate a veil of secrecy when an officer discharges a firearm or uses force? No, Mr. Speaker, that would be a step in the wrong direction that would further damage the relationship between law enforcement and the general public by eliminating scrutiny and increasing suspicion. It could also serve to endanger entire police forces by putting them under a blanket of public suspicion. We need to build trust instead. House Bill 1538 offers a statewide mandate to address a local issue. It does not address the core issues at hand regarding the current relationship between law enforcement and the general public. In fact, it will only serve to harm that relationship. In a free society governed by law, public servants hired by public officials and paid for by public dollars to use public resources to provide public safety must be subjected to public scrutiny and accountability. As makers of the law, if we deny such scrutiny, we're inviting the abandonment of both the rule of law and of freedom itself. For these reasons, Mr. Speaker, I urge a no vote on House Bill 1538. Thank you.